The sound was deafening, like a living chainsaw tearing through the air. I slammed the barn door shut, slid the iron bolt across, and gave one hard knock against the wooden crate. In an instant, a swarm of wasps erupted from their nest, pouring through the rafters like a storm of black and yellow fury. Inside, the once smug HOA board was no longer sipping wine or boasting about their community center. They were screaming, stumbling, clawing at the locked doors, their perfect suburban world dissolving into chaos. I stood outside in the night air, arms crossed, listening to the furious hum of wings and the shrieks of those who thought my land was theirs to claim. This wasn't cruelty, it was justice. They had broken into my barn, violated my property, and mocked everything my family built. Tonight, the Wasps became my enforcers, and the HOA finally understood whose ground they had trespassed upon. Before we begin this full story, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing how far our HOA battles reach across the globe. The moment I released the Wasps, I knew there was no turning back. The deafening hum from inside the barn echoed across the quiet night like a warning siren vibrating through my chest. I could hear the HOA board members scrambling, their muffled shouts growing higher pitched with every second. The same people who had stood on my porch weeks ago, demanding that I hand over my barn for the good of the community, were now reduced to frantic voices clawing for escape. As I leaned against the cool wooden wall of the barn, I couldn't help but remember how all of this began. A month earlier, my life had been as steady as the rhythm of a hammer hitting a nail. My farm sat on 18 acres of land just outside Cedar Ridge. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Passed down through 3 generations, it was a place where hard work meant more than appearances. I grew vegetables, raised chickens, and spent most evenings in my workshop inside the barn. And then there were the wasps. Most people hate wasps, but to me they were nature's soldiers. Their nests kept pests under control, and in the countryside they were as effective as any pesticide. I managed them carefully, never provoking them, always giving them space. They were territorial aggressive when disturbed, and I knew exactly how to channel that energy. In a way, the wasps mirrored my own stance toward the HOA. I wasn't looking for trouble, but if someone dared to invade my territory, I would defend it with everything I had. That someone was Marla Benton, the newly minted president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. Marla was the kind of woman who thrived on rules, the more arbitrary the better. She had the polished smile of a politician, the sharp eyes of a predator, and a blazer collection that probably cost more than my truck. From the first day she approached me, arms crossed and voice dripping with condescension. I knew she wasn't just curious about my land, she wanted control. Her first demand was almost laughable. "Your barn," she said with a practiced smile, "is simply wasted on just you." Think of what it could mean for the community: HOA meetings, fundraisers, social nights, all right here under your roof. I stared at her, wondering if she was joking. "You mean the roof I pay taxes for, the barn I repaired with my own hands? No, Marla, that's not happening." Her smile cracked for just a second before she plastered it back on. "Don't be selfish, Dylan. It's just a barn." "It's not just a barn," I shot back. "It's mine. And you're not setting foot in it." That was the first battle. I thought it would also be the last. I was wrong. Within a week, she returned, this time with a small entourage from her HOA board. They carried clipboards and tape measures, strutting around my barn as though they had jurisdiction. I watched them through the security cameras I had installed only days earlier. When I boomed my voice through the speaker, "Can I help you?" Marla looked straight into the camera and smirked. "We're conducting an assessment," she said. "Your barn is within proximity of HOA boundaries. We're considering classifying it as a community asset." My blood boiled. "It's private property. Get off my land." She waved dismissively to her lackeys. "Make a note about the paint on the siding. We'll draft a proposal." That was the day I realized this wasn't going to be a simple nuisance. It was a full-scale land grab disguised as community improvement. I stormed outside and confronted them face to face. Marla, unflinching, as always, whispered the words that would echo in my mind for weeks: "You'll regret this." And I did regret it. Regret that I hadn't shut her down harder. Regret that I underestimated her. Because what came next was a flood of letters. Formal notices accusing me of disrupting neighborhood aesthetics. Claims that my barn was underutilized. Threats of escalating the matter to zoning authorities if I didn't submit a community integration plan. I wasn't even part of their HOA yet. Here they were circling me like vultures. I thought things couldn't get worse. Until they did. One weekend, I took a much-needed trip with my sister and her kids. Before leaving, I asked Linda Park, my neighbor and friend, to keep an eye on things. She hated Marla almost as much as I did. But when I returned, Linda met me at the gate, breathless with anger. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "They threw a party. In your barn." I thought she was exaggerating. Then I saw the evidence. Streamers tangled in the trees, plastic cups scattered in the grass, the doors of my barn slightly ajar. Inside the scene was even worse. Tables, chairs, and half-deflated balloons littered the place. Someone had even moved my tools to make room for their decorations. And worst of all, one of my wasp enclosures had been tampered with the lid slightly ajar. They had poked and prodded at my living sentinels, thinking it was funny. That was the moment something snapped inside me. The letters I could ignore, the threats I could laugh off. But breaking into my barn, violating my property, disrespecting the very creatures I cared for, that was war. I gathered every shred of evidence from the cameras. Photos of Marla clinking glasses with her HOA cronies inside my barn. Video of them dragging catering tables through the dirt. And yes, even footage of Marla herself picking up a jar of honey I'd harvested, holding it like a party favor. I marched straight to the sheriff with the evidence, but he gave me the same line I'd heard before. They'll lawyer up. They'll call it a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, as if trespassing and theft were just casual mistakes. That night, as I sat on my porch staring at the barn, I realized the law would move too slowly. Marla knew how to bend rules and stall cases. If I wanted to protect my land, I needed to think smarter. And that's when the plan formed. I would bait them, make them think I'd given up, let them sneak back in. And then when they thought they'd won, I'd lock the doors and let the wasps speak for me. Standing there in the cool night air, listening to the chaos inside the barn, I knew the plan had worked. The HOA wanted my barn. Tonight they got it along with a swarm of furious wasps, reminding them exactly whose property this was. And this was only the beginning. The night I locked Marla and her cronies inside the barn with the wasps replayed in my head like a fever dream. Their shrieks, the pounding on the walls, the frantic rattling of the doors, it was a soundtrack of chaos I would never forget. But even as I stood outside, savoring my victory, I knew this was far from over. People like Marla didn't crumble overnight. They regrouped, they plotted, and then they struck back twice as hard. The next morning I awoke to find a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox. The HOA's logo was embossed across the top in garish green letters. I tore it open and read the pompous script. According to the letter I had engaged in, reckless and malicious conduct, endangering community members, and failed to uphold standards of public safety. The gall of it almost made me laugh. They had trespassed on my property, broken into my barn twice, tampered with my wasp enclosures, and yet here they were accusing me of being the danger. I set the letter down on the kitchen table and rubbed my temples. This wasn't just pettiness anymore. This was a declaration of war printed in legalese. I could already picture Marla, her hair perfect as always, pacing in her living room while dictating the letter to one of her obedient board members. She'd probably framed herself as a victim, a brave leader trying to restore order in the neighborhood. If only the rest of Cedar Ridge knew the truth. Well, they were about to. I called Linda over that afternoon. She arrived carrying a tray of coffee, her eyes sharp with curiosity. What now, she asked. I pushed the HOA's letter across the table. She scanned it, then snorted. Unbelievable. They throw a party on your property, nearly vandalize your barn, and now they're blaming you for, what, defending yourself? Exactly, I said. And I'm not going to let them control the narrative. Linda leaned back in her chair, a sly grin creeping across her face. You've got those security camera videos, right, of the party, the trespassing, everything. I nodded. I had hours of footage saved on my hard drive. Marla smirking as she rearranged my workbench, her board members carrying cases of wine through my barn, the entire fiasco preserved frame by frame. Then it's simple, Linda said. You go public. If they want to make this about community safety, let the community see who's really unsafe. It was a risky move, but I liked it. That evening, I uploaded several still images to the local Facebook group. Marla sipping champagne in my barn, a board member clumsily knocking over one of my tool racks, guests laughing while my no trespassing signs lay ripped on the ground. I wrote a short caption, when the HOA says they're protecting community values but instead break into private property, this is what it looks like. Cedar Ridge deserves better leadership. The post spread like wildfire. By midnight, it had been shared dozens of times. Comments flooded in half the neighborhood, outraged that Marla had crossed such a line. Some defended her, of course. There were always loyalists who couldn't see past her polished smile, but the tide was turning. For the first time, Marla wasn't controlling the story. The next day, she showed up at my gate. Her SUV idled by the road, its engine growling like a caged animal. She stepped out, heels clicking against the gravel, fury radiating from every pore. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Dylan?" she spat. I crossed my arms and leaned casually against the fence, exposing the truth. You trespassed. Twice. The town deserves to know. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she snapped. It was a harmless community gathering. Harmless. I pulled out my phone and played a clip. In the video, Marla stood inside my barn, one manicured hand wrapped around a jar of my honey. She handed it to a guest with a flourish, smiling like a queen distributing gifts. "That doesn't look harmless to me," I said. Her face drained of color. "That could be anyone." I paused the video and zoomed in. Her name tag, Marla Benton HOA President, was clear as day. Silence hung between us, broken only by the faint buzz of a wasp circling nearby. I smirked. "Care to explain?" She straightened, regaining some of her composure. "You'll regret this," she said coldly. "We have lawyers. We have influence. You're just one man with a barn and some bugs." "Wasps," I corrected. "And I've got more than that. I've got evidence, witnesses, and the truth. You can't spin this, Marla." For the first time since I'd known her, she looked rattled. Not defeated, not yet, but shaken. She turned sharply and stalked back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard the echo rolled across the fields. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to scare her off. But I underestimated how much power meant to Marla. 2 days later, more letters arrived. Anonymous complaints filed with the county about my wasp enclosures. Claims that they were a public health hazard. Dog walkers suddenly loitering suspiciously close to my property lined their phones out as if they were documenting violations. Someone even left a note stuffed under my door that read, "You don't belong here." The HOA always wins. It was intimidation, plain and simple. But intimidation works only if you let it. I met with Deputy Harris at the sheriff's office again. He was a solid guy, one of the few officials in town who saw through Marla's games. I handed him another flash drive filled with footage, along with a folder of the bogus complaints. He whistled low. "She's doubling down. You sure you're ready for where this is headed?" "Absolutely," I said. "If she wants a war, she'll get one. But this time I'm not just fighting back. I'm going to make sure she pays for every inch of ground she tried to steal." Harris gave me a look that was half admiration, half caution. "Just keep it legal, Dylan. Don't give her any ammo." I nodded, though in my heart I knew the Wasps were only the beginning. Marla wanted to play games with paper and politics. I was ready to answer with steel evidence, and yes, a swarm or two if she pushed me again. As I walked out of the sheriff's office, I could feel the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on me. Marla wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, but neither would I. The barn, the land, the legacy of my family, it all meant too much to surrender. And if that meant unleashing the fury of the Wasps again, then so be it. The night after my confrontation with Marla, I barely slept. Every creak of the farmhouse felt like footsteps approaching. Every rustle of leaves outside stirred my instincts. I knew she wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The HOA had too much pride, too much money, and too many connections for them to back down after being humiliated by a swarm of wasps. If anything, their arrogance would force them to retaliate harder. When the sun rose, I walked the perimeter of my property, inspecting every corner of the fence line. The grass was still wet with dew, and fresh tire tracks scarred the dirt road leading up to the barn. They weren't from my truck. Someone had been there during the night. My stomach tightened. I hurried to check the barn. The heavy wooden doors were still bolted from the outside exactly as I'd left them, but my cameras caught everything. Later, in the quiet of my kitchen, I replayed the footage. There she was, Marla standing at the edge of the field with 2 board members. They didn't dare come close this time, but I could see them pointing, gesturing, whispering, like generals surveying a battlefield before the next assault. Linda stopped by later that afternoon, her face pale. "They're spreading rumors," she said breathlessly. "The HOA is telling everyone you keep dangerous insects as weapons. Some of the parents in town are saying your wasps are a threat to their children." I laughed bitterly. "So now my pest control is a public menace. That's rich." Linda didn't smile. "You don't get it, Dylan. They're trying to paint you as unstable, as someone unfit to live here. If they can make the town believe you're dangerous, they can push for zoning enforcement, or worse." She was right. It wasn't enough for Marla to harass me with parties and trespassing. She wanted to destroy my reputation. And in Cedar Ridge, reputation carried weight. A farmer branded as reckless or hazardous could lose contracts, customers, even the support of neighbors. That night I sat on the porch staring at the glowing windows of the HOA neighborhood across the road. Each identical house looked like a clone of the next, perfect lawns, manicured shrubs, and driveways lined with matching SUVs. It was a world that thrived on conformity, a world where individuality was stamped out like a weed. And here I was, the weed they couldn't tolerate. I knew I had to act first. The next morning, I went into town with a stack of printed photos. Shots from my cameras of Marla and her crew sneaking into my barn, Pictures of the party, decorations, the spilled wine, the torn down no trespassing signs. I pinned them to the bulletin board outside the diner, taped them to the post office wall, even handed copies to the clerk at the hardware store. By noon, the town was buzzing louder than my wasps. At the feed store, an old rancher named Cole clapped me on the shoulder. "Heard about what they did to your barn. Damn shame. Don't let those HOA suits push you around. This town's built on men like you, not them." His support meant more than I let on, but I knew words wouldn't stop Marla. She needed to be cornered in her own game paperwork law and exposure. That evening, another letter arrived, hand-delivered by one of her lackeys. This one bore an official seal, notice of compliance review. They demanded I submit a community integration plan for my barn, outlining how it could be used to benefit the neighborhood. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in escalation to county zoning enforcement. I read it twice, then tore it clean in half. My barn was not theirs to integrate. Instead, I called my cousin Nathan, a lawyer in the next county. Over the phone, I explained everything, every party, every trespass, every bogus letter. He whistled low. "They're overstepping hard. Trespassing, harassment, even potential fraud, if they're misusing HOA funds for these so-called events." "Can we fight back legally?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said, "but lawsuits take time. If you want immediate relief, we file for a restraining order against Marla and the HOA board. That stops them from stepping foot on your land while the civil case moves forward." I felt a spark of hope. Finally, a weapon as sharp as theirs. While Nathan prepared the paperwork, I worked on another front, my defenses. I reinforced the barn doors with steel brackets, replaced the locks with a keypad system, and moved several of the wasp enclosures closer to the perimeter. Not to release them, but to remind anyone foolish enough to trespass that I wasn't bluffing. Signs went up on every corner of the fence. "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. Wasps on site." A few nights later, the HOA struck again. My cameras caught Marla and two men creeping up the driveway under cover of darkness. They carried clipboards and flashlights, whispering as they tried to document violations. One of them aimed his flashlight toward the wasp enclosures, only to recoil when the insects buzzed angrily in response. I almost laughed watching them stumble back. This time I didn't confront them directly. Instead, I saved the footage and delivered it to Deputy Harris the next morning. He reviewed it jaw tight. "Second trespass. Third if we count the party. They're digging their own graves, Dylan. I'll file a report and add it to your case." By the weekend, the restraining order was official. Marla was served in front of half the neighborhood, a sight that sent whispers flying faster than gossip at Sunday service. Linda told me later that some board members were already grumbling, questioning her leadership. But Marla wasn't done. She called an emergency HOA meeting, blasting out emails claiming I was the aggressor, that my wasps were a weaponized hazard threatening everyone nearby. She wanted to spin the story, make me the villain. Too bad I came prepared. When the meeting began, I was waiting just outside the HOA clubhouse with a laptop and a portable projector. As residents filed in, I played the footage on the side of the building, Marla unlocking my barn, her board hauling wine, inside partygoers, trashing my tools, and finally her clutching that jar of honey with her name tag front and center. Gasps filled the air. Some residents stormed out of the meeting before it even began. By the time the projector shut off, Marla's empire had cracks running through every corner. She could shout, she could lie, she could deny, but the truth was in the footage, and Cedar Ridge had seen it with their own eyes. As I packed up my equipment, I felt the weight of the battle shifting. For the first time, Marla was on the defensive, and I wasn't done yet. Because the war for my barn, my land, and my dignity had only just begun. The fallout from the public projection shook Cedar Ridge like an earthquake. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, its board members feared more than respected. They handed out violation notices like candy-fined residents for leaving their trash cans out too long, and dictated what color shutters people could paint their homes. Most folks grumbled but complied. Marla thrived in that environment. Control was her oxygen. But when the video of her party in my barn splashed across the side of the clubhouse, her oxygen was cut off. The next morning, Linda called me nearly breathless with excitement. "Dylan, you won't believe this. Half the neighborhood board has turned on Marla. They're whispering about misuse of HOA funds, saying she authorized expenses without approval. People are furious." I smiled grimly. "Good. Let them eat each other alive." But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Cornered animals lash out hardest, and Marla was nothing if not vicious when backed into a corner. My hunch proved correct 2 days later when I received another letter, this time not from the HOA but from the county zoning office. It claimed they'd received multiple complaints about my barn being unsafe, about my wasp enclosures being a biohazard, and about illegal commercial activities taking place on my property. I nearly tore the paper in half right there. Marla had escalated to pulling strings outside her HOA bubble. If the county bought her lies, they could slap me with fines, inspections, even force me to shut down parts of my farm. I phoned my cousin Nathan immediately. He chuckled darkly when I explained. Classic move. When they can't win legally, they weaponize bureaucracy. Don't worry, I'll draft a response citing property rights and pest management exemptions. But in the meantime, document everything. If inspectors come, we make sure the truth is impossible to ignore. That night, I moved through the barn with a camera of my own, narrating every corner of the space. The organized shelves of tools, the locked cabinets for equipment, the carefully maintained wasp enclosures labeled and documented like any agricultural operation. No contraband, no hazards, no illegal activity, just a farmer protecting his land. I uploaded the video to YouTube under the title, "The Truth About My Barn, What the HOA Doesn't Want You to See." Within hours, locals were sharing it, defending me in comment sections, tagging the county's social media accounts. If Marla wanted a smear campaign, I was going to drown her lies in sunlight. The pressure on her intensified. At the next HOA meeting, residents demanded answers. Where had the budget for the party decorations come from? Why had HOA funds been used to rent catering tables that mysteriously appeared in my barn? Why were legal fees suddenly skyrocketing on the association's ledger? A man named Eric, one of the quieter board members, finally snapped. According to Linda, who attended, he stood up mid-meeting and said, "We followed Marla because we thought she had vision. Now all I see is someone who can't separate her personal vendetta from her duty. She's costing us money, reputation, and peace." The room had erupted in applause. But Marla wasn't finished scheming. The very next evening, my cameras caught her sneaking back onto my property. This time, she wasn't in a blazer and heels. She wore dark jeans and a hoodie, her hair tied back, her face partially hidden. She thought if she looked less like herself, the cameras wouldn't catch her. She was wrong. I watched in disbelief as she crept toward the wasp enclosures. My heart slammed in my chest. She was holding a can of pesticide. "Not tonight," I muttered, grabbing my flashlight and shotgun before storming outside. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, landing squarely on her. She froze like a raccoon caught in headlights. "Drop it, Marla," I barked. For a moment she hesitated, her knuckles white around the can. Then she let it fall to the dirt with a hollow clank. "You've lost your mind," I said, stepping closer. "Poisoning livestock. That's not just trespassing anymore. That's criminal destruction of property." Her voice shook the first crack in her perfect composure I'd ever heard. "They're dangerous. You're putting everyone at risk." "No," I cut her off. "You're the risk. You broke into my barn, you trashed my property, you lied to the county, and now you're trying to kill what doesn't belong to you." She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing there was no defense left. My cameras had caught everything, the pesticide, her face, her trespass. This wasn't hearsay anymore. This was hard evidence. The next day, I handed the footage to Deputy Harris. He shook his head in disbelief. "She's cooked." Between this and the restraining order, the DA could charge her with attempted destruction of agricultural property. That's serious time, Dylan. A part of me felt vindicated. Another part pitied her. Marla had built her identity around power, but now the very tools she used to control others' fear, intimidation, lies, were snapping back at her like a wasp sting. Still, I knew better than to assume the battle was over. Marla wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She'd thrash, she'd scream, she'd drag others down with her if she had to. And the HOA still existed as an institution, one that might try to protect itself even if it meant throwing her to the wolves. That night I poured myself a stiff drink and sat on the porch staring out at the barn. The hum of the wasps inside was steady, almost comforting. They were like me, territorial, relentless, unwilling to bow to invaders. "Keep buzzing," I whispered to them. "We're not done yet." And deep down, I knew the real showdown was still coming, the moment when either Marla would be crushed under the weight of her own arrogance, or she'd take one last desperate swing that could drag us both into ruin. One way or another, Cedar Ridge would never be the same. By the time autumn rolled in, Cedar Ridge had become a battleground. The leaves on the trees turned amber and gold, but beneath the beauty tension poisoned the air. Every trip into town felt like stepping onto a stage where half the audience cheered for me and the other half whispered behind my back, parroting Marla's claims that I was some kind of madman with weaponized wasps. But I wasn't the one breaking laws. She was. And I knew her pride wouldn't let her rest until she made one last move. That move came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday night when I got the alert on my phone. My cameras had picked up movement near the barn. At first, I thought it was raccoons, but when I tapped into the live feed, my jaw tightened. There they were, Marla and 4 HOA board members, dragging folding tables, chairs, and even a projector screen straight through the gravel path. They were dressed in casual clothes this time, hoodies and jeans, as if trying to disguise themselves, but there was no mistaking who they were. And just like that, my plan slid into place. For weeks, I'd been waiting for them to make this mistake again. I had left one side of the barn camera conspicuously missing a subtle invitation that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't watching as closely anymore. I even let the front gate lock hang loose one evening so they'd think I was careless. It was bait plain and simple, and like greedy fish they had bitten down hard. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and made my way through the fields. The night air was crisp, my breath fogging in the beam of the moonlight. As I approached the barn, I could hear them laughing inside, already setting up as if the place belonged to them. I slid the heavy doors shut and dropped the steel bolt into place. The clang echoed like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. For a second there was silence inside. Then the shouting started. "What the who locked this?" someone yelled. "Try the other door," another voice snapped. I stood outside calm as a stone, listening to their panic. My fingers drummed against the wooden crate sitting near the vent. Inside, the wasps had grown restless from all the commotion, their wings buzzing like a live wire waiting to spark. "Who's out there?" Marla's voice rang sharp and furious. "Open this door immediately, you're committing a crime." I smirked. "Funny, that's exactly what I was going to say to you." I gave the crate a firm knock. The vibration set the swarm off. The sound was like nothing else on earth, thousands of wings vibrating in unison, rising into a frenzy. Within seconds, the first few wasps slipped through the slats of the vent and into the barn. The reaction inside was instant. Screams, desperate, uncoordinated shrieks that pierced the night. Chairs clattered, a table overturned. Someone bellowed, "They're everywhere, get them off me." "Don't swat. Don't swat," another voice cried, but panic drowned out reason. I leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold in my mind as clearly as if I were standing inside. My wasps weren't bred to kill, but anyone trapped in a tight space with them would feel the sting of trespass written on their skin. Marla's shriek cut above the rest. "You'll pay for this. Dylan Harper, do you hear me? You'll pay." Her words were shaky, desperate, not the commanding tone of a queen, but the flailing cries of someone who'd lost her grip on power. I let them sweat for several minutes. The buzzing grew louder, the screams wilder. Then with deliberate calm, I slid the bolt free and pulled open the door. They came pouring out like rats from a sinking ship, hair disheveled faces streaked with sweat and fear swatting frantically at the air. One board member sprinted across the field without even looking back. Another tripped and crawled on his hands and knees until he cleared the barn's threshold. And then Marla appeared. Her blazer was gone, her once perfect hair tangled, her face pale. Her eyes locked on me with pure venom. She staggered forward, clutching at her sleeve, where a welt was already rising. "You're insane," she hissed, her voice raw. "You've endangered lives. This is assault." I shook my head slowly. "No, Marla. This is me protecting my property. You broke in again. You set up in my barn again. You ignored every warning, every law, every shred of decency. And now you've reaped exactly what you sowed." Behind her, the other board members looked less like allies and more like deserters. Their glares weren't aimed at me, they were aimed at her. Whispers of, "I told you this was a bad idea," floated through the night. For the first time, Marla stood alone. She clenched her fists, trembling with rage. "This isn't over." I stepped closer, lowering my voice until only she could hear. "It is over, Marla, because this time I've got everything on camera. You breaking in, you trespassing, you setting up for your so-called community event. You don't get to spin this anymore. The sheriff will see the footage, the judge will see it. And Cedar Ridge will know who you really are." Her lips quivered, but no words came out. She turned humiliated and stalked off into the night with her defeated entourage trailing behind her. When the field fell silent again, I glanced back at the barn. The wasps were calming down their hum, fading back to the steady rhythm I knew so well. I whispered a quiet thanks to them, my unlikely allies in this war. That night, I didn't sleep either. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. Because I knew tomorrow morning, when I handed the footage to Deputy Harris, the scales of justice would finally tip in my favor. Marla had crossed the line for the last time, and now she would pay. The morning after the Wasp incident, I woke to a silence so thick it felt unnatural. No letters shoved into the mailbox. No strange cars idling near my driveway. Not even the usual joggers from the HOA neighborhood across the road. It was as if Cedar Ridge itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window with my laptop. My cameras had captured everything, Marla and her board members dragging equipment into my barn, the way they jumped when the bolts slid into place, the flailing chaos as the wasps poured down from the rafters. Every angle was clear, every face unmistakable. I clipped together the footage into a clean chronological file and labeled it HOA Trespass Final Evidence. Then I loaded it onto a flash drive and slid it into my pocket. At 9 sharp, I drove to the sheriff's office. Deputy Harris met me in the lobby, already expecting me. He ushered me into his office, closed the door, and leaned forward with a serious expression. "Tell me you got it all." I handed him the flash drive. "Every second. You won't believe the stupidity until you see it." He plugged it in, and together we watched the events unfold on his monitor. Marla's smirk as she crossed into my barn, her cronies setting up tables like they were hosting a wedding, the bolt sliding into place. And then the panic, the swarm, the stampede out the door. Harris whistled low. "Good Lord," he muttered. "She just buried herself." "You can charge her, right?" I asked. He nodded. "Trespassing, breaking, and entering attempted destruction of agricultural property. Given this is the 3rd documented incident, the DA is going to salivate over this. And her board accessories. They're in the same boat." A weight lifted from my chest, but it wasn't relief yet. Not until I saw Marla actually face the consequences. By noon, word had spread. It always did in small towns. A few curious neighbors lingered at the edge of my driveway, whispering. One woman called out, "Dylan, is it true you locked them in with wasps?" I didn't answer directly. "It's true they trespassed," I said firmly. "And it's true I've got evidence." That was enough. Within hours, Cedar Ridge's Facebook group was on fire again. Some accused me of being reckless, others hailed me as a hero for standing up to Marla. Memes circulated photoshopped images of Marla running from a cartoon swarm of giant wasps, captions like Queen Bee meets real stingers. Linda stopped by in the afternoon, grinning ear to ear. "You've done it, Dylan. The board is fracturing. Eric resigned this morning. 2 others are demanding a vote to suspend Marla. They're calling her toxic, a liability." I leaned against the porch railing, sipping my coffee. Took them long enough. But Marla wasn't the type to go quietly. That evening, a new letter arrived, not in the mailbox this time, but shoved under my door. The handwriting was sharp, angry, almost carved into the page. "This is not finished. You will regret humiliating me. You'll regret ever crossing the HOA." I laughed bitterly. Even now, she clung to the delusion of power, as if a handwritten threat could erase her crimes. I slipped the note into an evidence folder and locked it away. Every move she made was just more rope to hang herself with. 2 days later, the county inspectors arrived. Clipboards in hand, neon vests gleaming, they walked the perimeter of my barn with tight expressions. "We've had several complaints," one of them said, eyes flicking to the wasp enclosures. I braced myself. This was Marla's last weapon, bureaucracy. If they ruled my farm unsafe, she could claim victory even in disgrace. But I was ready. I showed them the meticulous records. I kept the maintenance logs, the pest control exemptions under state law. I walked them through the barn, pointing out every safety measure I'd installed, locks, ventilation signage. When they tried to push, I countered with statutes I'd studied late into the night. After 3 tense hours, the lead inspector closed his clipboard. "Everything appears compliant. The complaints were exaggerated." I couldn't resist smirking. Exaggerated, try fabricated. When they left, I knew the tide had fully turned. Marla's last gambit had failed. That weekend, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The clubhouse parking lot overflowed with cars, residents buzzing louder than my wasps. Linda attended, and later recounted the chaos to me. People tore into her, Dylan. Parents furious, she put their kids at risk by sneaking into your barn. Members demanding to know how much HOA money was wasted on her parties. She tried to spin it, of course, claimed you manipulated the footage, that you staged the whole thing, but no one bought it. Not after the inspector's report cleared you. And then I asked. Linda's eyes sparkled, and then they voted. Marla's out, removed as president, effective immediately. The words settled over me like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. For months she had poisoned my life, invaded my land, twisted the truth, and now she was finished. Or so it seemed. The following day I saw her for what I hoped would be the last time. A moving truck backed into her driveway, boxes stacked on the porch. Marla stood by the curb, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing furiously. But her posture was different, no longer regal, no longer commanding, just frantic, defeated. When she noticed me watching from across the road, her eyes burned with hatred. For a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. I raised my coffee in a mock salute. "Need help packing." Her Her jaw clenched, and without a word she turned her back. By sunset, the truck was gone, and so was she. Cedar Ridge felt different after that. Quieter. Lighter. Neighbors who had once avoided me now waved from their driveways. Parents brought their kids by to see the chickens, even asking cautious questions about the wasps. The HOA board under new leadership sent me a formal letter of apology and a reimbursement check for damages. I never thought I'd live to see the day. But most of all, I had my land back, uncontested, untarnished mine. As I walked the fields that evening, the barn stood proud against the fading light, its wood glowing gold in the sunset. From inside, the wasps hummed their steady song, a reminder that even the smallest, fiercest creatures could protect what mattered. Marla had underestimated me. She had underestimated them. And in doing so, she had sealed her own downfall. Yet some part of me couldn't shake the thought people like Marla don't just disappear. They fester, waiting for another chance. Maybe one day I'd hear her name again tied to some other scandal in some other town. But here in Cedar Ridge, her reign was over, and my farm, my barn was free. When Marla's moving truck rolled out of Cedar Ridge, most people thought the saga had ended. Neighbors whispered with relief, the HOA board scrambled to rebuild its tattered image, and for the first time in months, my farm felt safe again. But I knew better. Legal battles don't vanish. When the villain drives away, they linger like smoke after a fire. 2 weeks later, I received a thick envelope in the mail. This time it wasn't another empty HOA letter. It was stamped with the county court seal. Inside was a notice: civil case pending Harper v. Cedar Ridge, HOA. My cousin Nathan had filed the lawsuit we'd prepared. Trespass, property damage, harassment. Conversion, the legal term for when someone takes or uses your property without permission. And we had the evidence, the videos, the photos, the inspector's report, even the note Marla had scrawled in rage. For once, I wasn't on defense. I was the one dragging them into the arena. Nathan called that evening. They're going to try to settle fast, he said. The board knows Marla poisoned their reputation. They'll want this swept under the rug. Good, I replied. But we're not letting them off easy. They need to pay literally and publicly. He chuckled. That's the spirit. Don't worry, I'll push for maximum damages. You'll get compensation for the barn repairs, lost honey sales, legal fees, the works. It wasn't just about the money. It was about principle. The HOA had tried to crush me under their rules, their threats, their arrogance. Now they were the ones squirming. Meanwhile, the story spread beyond Cedar Ridge. The local newspaper had already run 2 articles about the barn wars, as they called it. Then a regional news outlet picked it up. Their headline still makes me grin: HOA president ousted after wasps, used as unlikely defense. Before long, my inbox was flooded with reporters asking for interviews. Some wanted the gritty details of the feud. Others wanted tips on alternative pest control methods. I agreed to one interview on a local radio station. The host introduced me as the man who fought back against an HOA with nothing but grit and a swarm of wasps. I corrected him quickly. It wasn't about the wasps. It was about standing your ground when bullies think they can take what isn't theirs. Listeners called in afterward, sharing their own HOA horror stories. One man said he'd been fined for leaving his garage door open too long. A woman recounted how she was forced to remove a vegetable garden because it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Their voices were laced with the same frustration I'd carried for months. It struck me then my fight wasn't just personal anymore. It had become a symbol. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Marla, even disgraced and ousted, tried to claw back her narrative. She gave a statement to a local blogger calling me unstable and accusing me of staging the entire wasp incident. He manipulated footage to frame us, she insisted, but the weight of evidence crushed her words. Every denial made her look smaller, more desperate. The HOA board, desperate to salvage their standing, distanced themselves quickly. They issued a public apology, claiming Marla had acted unilaterally and promising reforms. But the damage was done. Families who once worshipped the HOA's order now muttered about wasted dues and corrupt leadership. Attendance at meetings plummeted. The board had lost its grip. Meanwhile, Nathan pressed the lawsuit forward. In depositions, board members cracked under questioning, admitting they had followed Marla into my barn without written authorization. One even confessed they had known the party was illegal, but didn't want to upset her. Their cowardice was my weapon. Finally, the board offered a settlement: full reimbursement for damages, a payout for emotional distress, and a legally binding agreement that the HOA would never again attempt to claim jurisdiction over my land. Nathan called it a victory. I called it justice. When the settlement check arrived, I stared at it for a long time. It was more money than I'd expected, enough to repair the barn, upgrade the farm, even expand the wasp enclosures into a proper agricultural research project. But it wasn't the dollar amount that mattered. It was the acknowledgement, the official stamp that said, they were wrong. I was right. The strangest part came after. A university entomologist reached out, having read about my case. He wanted to study the way I maintained the wasp colonies for natural pest control. You may have stumbled into a model for sustainable farming, he told me. I had to laugh. My private feud with the HOA was now being discussed in academic circles. As for Marla, her downfall was spectacular. Word spread that she'd tried to run for a similar position in another neighborhood 2 towns over. They rejected her immediately, citing her reputation. Rumor had it she was renting a small condo alone, far from Cedar Ridge, her once perfect image shattered. One evening, as I hammered a new sign onto the barn, private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. The Wasps remember. Linda walked up smiling. Never thought I'd see the day, she said. The queen dethroned, the kingdom humbled, and you still standing. I smiled back. It wasn't just me. It was everyone who stood up. You, Harris Nathan. And the Wasps, of course. She laughed. Can't forget them. We stood there in the fading light, listening to the steady hum from inside the barn. It was a song of resilience, of nature's raw power, harnessed not for cruelty, but for justice. The HOA had wanted my barn as their community center. Instead, it had become a monument to defiance, to truth, and to the sting of consequences. And for the first time in months, I felt free. The dust had finally begun to settle. With Marla gone, the HOA disarmed, and the lawsuit closed in my favor, Cedar Ridge felt like a different place. The once pristine neighborhood across the road still looked the same, identical lawns, identical mailboxes, but there was a shift in the air. The people who once looked at me with suspicion now nodded politely, even waved. Some of them even brought over baked goods or jars of jam as peace offerings, as though they'd suddenly remembered what it meant to be neighbors rather than enforcers. I spent the first week after the settlement restoring my barn. I replaced broken boards, polished the workbenches, and scrubbed the last sticky stains from the HOA's wild party. It was tedious work, but it was healing too. Each nail driven into the wood was like reclaiming another piece of my dignity. When the repairs were finished, the barn looked sturdier than ever. The Wasps, of course, never cared about the chaos. Their nests hummed with the same steady rhythm, their wings slicing the air like little engines of nature. I'd moved them into reinforced enclosures, not just for safety, but also to remind anyone who might pass by that they were permanent residents of this farm. To me, they weren't just insects anymore. They were a symbol of defiance, of patience, of sting when provoked. But victory is rarely neat. Even with Marla gone, rumors swirled. Some claimed I'd gone too far, that locking people in with wasps was cruel. Others whispered that I was a folk hero who had shown the HOA bullies their place. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. I hadn't sought glory. I'd sought respect for boundaries. One evening, Linda joined me on the porch. She brought her usual thermos of sweet tea and plopped down in the chair beside me. So she said, staring out at the glowing barn, "Do you think it's really over?" I considered her question. Over with Marla, yes. Over with the HOA. Maybe not. Power doesn't just die, it finds new hands. She nodded. Still, you've shown them you're not a man to push around. I chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe I've just made myself the one guy they'll never stop whispering about. She leaned over and clinked her thermos against my glass. Better whispered about than walked over. That night after she left, I stood at the edge of the field and looked back at the barn. A new sign hung on the door, the one I'd hammered in after the lawsuit, private property, the Wasps remember. It wasn't just a warning to trespassers. It was a promise to myself. Weeks passed and life slipped into a rhythm again. I harvested vegetables, repaired fences, and spent evenings sketching plans for expanding the farm. Nathan encouraged me to use some of the settlement money to build a second structure, a greenhouse maybe, or even a small honey processing shed. Turn your fight into growth, he said. I liked the sound of that. Meanwhile, the new HOA board made sweeping changes. They cut dues, scrapped half the old rules, and even sent out a letter asking residents to propose their own community projects. For the first time, Cedar Ridge felt less like a dictatorship and more like a neighborhood. People credited the Wasp War for the reforms, though the board avoided mentioning it outright. And Marla. The last I heard, she'd left the state entirely. A mutual acquaintance spotted her in a grocery store 2 towns over, looking gaunt and bitter, muttering to herself in the checkout line. She was a ghost now, no longer queen, no longer feared. just another reminder that arrogance once stripped of power crumbles into dust. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fencing, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. About the night I slammed the barn doors shut and let the Wasps defend what was mine. About the fear on Marla's face when her empire unraveled. About the neighbors who had chosen silence until the truth screamed too loud to ignore. And I realized something important. The real victory wasn't that I'd won against Marla. The real victory was that I hadn't let her change me. I hadn't given up my land, my identity, or my right to stand firm. I had fought back, yes, but I'd also chosen restraint. The Wasps hadn't been a weapon to destroy, they'd been a reminder of boundaries of consequences. That night, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in molten gold, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The hum from the barn drifted across the yard, steady and constant, like the beating heart of the land itself. I thought of my grandfather who had built this farm with his hands. I thought of my father who had taught me that land isn't just dirt, it's history, blood, and memory. And I thought of the generations to come who would inherit a place that had been defended not just with nails and wood, but with resolve. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. The HOA had tried to claim my barn. Marla had tried to crush my spirit. But in the end, they'd learned the hardest truth of all. Some things can't be stolen, borrowed, or bullied into submission. Some things fight back. And sometimes those things buzz. Looking back, the battle with Marla taught me more than I ever expected. It wasn't just about keeping a barn or winning a lawsuit. It was about the value of standing firm when you know you're right. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. And when people try to trample on those things, silence only feeds their power. What stopped Marla wasn't anger alone. It was preparation, evidence, and the courage to act. In life, we all face our own HOAs, people or systems that try to box us in, strip us of individuality, or make us doubt our worth. But you don't have to fold. You can defend what matters with wit, with grit, and yes, sometimes with a swarm of wasps, if that's what it takes. If this story struck a chord with you, share your own battles in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Because around here, every fight has a lesson, and every lesson deserves to be heard.